There comes a point in every wealth builder's journey when they realize that the difference between poverty and prosperity is not opportunity, it's responsibility. The moment you decide to take full ownership of your thoughts, your decisions, your results, you activate a force that separates you from the masses. Most people hand over their power without realizing it. They blame circumstances. They wait for ideal conditions. They believe success belongs to someone else. But the one who builds wealth knows this. No one is coming to save you. No one is responsible for your future but you. And once that truth is accepted not as a burden but as a gift, you begin to think differently. You stop reacting to life and begin designing it. You stop explaining why you can't and start focusing on how you will. And that mindset shift from victim to builder is the birthplace of every fortune ever made. Responsibility is the foundation of internal power. It is the quiet decision that says, everything that happens next is mine to create, not because you control the world, but because you control your thoughts, and thoughts repeated become beliefs. Beliefs shape behavior, and behavior shapes destiny. This is not opinion, it is structure. A self-governed mind becomes a self-made life, and if you want to build wealth that lasts, you must govern your mind with relentless clarity. That means no more casual thinking, no more reactive thoughts, no more rehearsing limitation. Every thought is either building or breaking your future, and when you realize this, you begin to think on purpose. You begin to carry the posture of a builder, and when your posture changes, your reality follows. This is why so few people ever become truly wealthy, because responsibility is uncomfortable. It removes the excuses. It ends the negotiations. It requires a level of mental maturity that most never choose to develop. But those who do, those who assume full ownership of their lives, begin to generate results so powerful that others can't help but take notice. They move with intention. They speak with certainty. They act without waiting. And that consistency of behavior driven by a consistency of thought becomes unstoppable. Not loud, not frantic, unstoppable, because it is rooted in alignment. And alignment between what you think, say, and do is magnetic. It attracts opportunity. It commands respect. It builds momentum, and momentum is what transforms good ideas into great realities. Let me tell you what responsibility looks like in practice. It looks like getting up early to study when no one is asking you to. It looks like reviewing your goals daily, even when results are slow. It looks like taking the blame when something fails instead of pointing fingers. It looks like controlling your inputs, what you watch, who you speak to, what you believe, because you understand that every input becomes an influence. And it looks like doing the work even when the mood is gone, especially when the mood is gone. Because success is not built on mood, it's built on standards. And your standards are a reflection of what you believe you deserve. If you raise them, the world will respond. If you lower them, the world will oblige. But the starting point, the lever, is thought. Now let's go further. Responsibility is not just about ownership, it's about direction. Once you accept that you are responsible for your future, the next question is, where are you steering it? What vision is guiding you? What mental image are you feeding into your subconscious every day? Because without direction, responsibility becomes pressure. But with direction, responsibility becomes power. The wealth builder understands this. He sets a vision so clear, so compelling, that every thought, every action, every behavior begins to orbit around it. This is the mental alignment that produces acceleration. It's not random, it's not chaotic, it's structured, focused, intentional, and over time that level of clarity carves a path that others begin to follow. But it didn't start with charisma, it started with responsibility for thought. Here's the test. If I followed you around for a week and wrote down every thought you allowed to stay in your mind, what would it tell me about your future? Would I see someone designing a life of wealth, freedom, and contribution? Or someone rehearsing fear, doubt, and distraction? Your dominant thought patterns are your forecast. They are your silent blueprints. And if you don't like the blueprint, don't curse the builder. Change the plan. That plan begins with what you allow into your mind, what you dwell on, what you repeat, what you defend. Most people defend their limitations without realizing it. They argue for why it's hard, why it's too late, why they can't. But those destined for wealth defend their vision. They defend their standards. They defend their boundaries. Because they understand if you don't defend your vision, the world will bury it. Write this down. Wealth is not accidental. It is intentional. It is the byproduct of thought applied with discipline over time. Not weeks, not months, years. The person who is willing to think about the same goal every day for a decade is the person who will eventually outlast, outperform, and out-earn everyone around them. Not because they were the best, but because they were the most responsible with their focus. They didn't let their mind wander. They didn't abandon their path when it got hard. They chose to stay in alignment day after day, and eventually the world had no choice but to respond. So what does this mean for you? It means that starting today, you are responsible for the quality of your thinking. You are responsible for the direction of your life. You are responsible for the standard you hold. No one else is to blame, not your past, not your environment, not your family, only you. And that is not a curse, it is a blessing, because it means you hold the pen. You are writing the script, and if you don't like the first act, write a new one. But don't wait, don't stall, don't hesitate. Begin now, think with purpose, live with responsibility, and watch as your world reshapes itself to match your new alignment. Most people misunderstand wealth because they misunderstand its origin. They think it starts in the bank or in a business or with a degree or with a job title. But true wealth, lasting self-generated, principle-driven wealth, starts in one place, the mind. Not just any mind, but a mind trained to think independently, creatively, and persistently about value. Because wealth is the direct result of value creation. And value creation is a mental process before it is ever a financial one. The greatest fortunes in the world didn't begin with inheritance or connections or even talent. They began with observation, imagination, and thought. The thought said, there is a need here. The imagination said, there is a way to meet that need. And the discipline said, I will follow through until it's real. That is the mental engine that builds empires. That is the root system of all sustainable wealth. Let's examine the pattern. The first step in building wealth is not action, it's attention. The individual destined for wealth begins by noticing what others ignore. He notices problems, patterns, inefficiencies, gaps. He listens more than he talks. He watches not with judgment, but with curiosity. And from this observation, a seed of possibility begins to form. He begins to ask, what if? What if there were a better way? What if this problem could be solved more efficiently? What if I could be the one to build that solution? And from that question, a vision forms, not a vague desire, a real picture, clear, tangible, anchored in value. Most people skip this step. They jump straight into doing. But wealth builders are first mental builders. They spend more time thinking than reacting. And because of that, when they act, their actions are leveraged. They're purposeful. They're rare. And rarity is what creates value. This is why I say the most valuable skill in the world is focused thinking. Not scattered thinking, not reactive thinking, focused, deep-directed thought. Thought that lingers on a problem until the solution begins to surface. Thought that resists distraction and shallow answers. Thought that, like a miner, keeps digging until it finds the gold. This kind of thinking is rare because it's hard, it's not flashy, it doesn't produce immediate results. But over time, it outpaces and out-earns every other form of effort. Because the person who can think clearly will always be able to create value. And the person who can create value will never be poor. No matter what happens to the economy, the market, or the world around him, his wealth is internal before it is external. And that internal wealth is what gives him stability, confidence, and freedom. Let me give you a mental tool that wealth builders use daily. It's called the problem-value loop. They begin each day by asking, what problem can I solve today that others ignore or tolerate? Then they follow that with, how can I solve it in a way that creates more value than expected? That's it. That loop repeated every day becomes a habit, and that habit becomes an identity. Over time, the person becomes known not just for working hard, but for thinking usefully. They become sought after. Their name becomes associated with solutions, with insight, with results. And eventually, those associations translate into income, influence, and opportunity. This is not a mystery. It is the natural effect of disciplined mental focus. The rule is simple. If you want to be paid more, solve more valuable problems. But to do that, you must first think more valuable thoughts. Now here's where it gets interesting. Most people try to copy what others are doing. But the wealth builder asks a better question. What is no one doing well yet? Instead of following the herd, he studies the edges. He looks for the overlooked, the unsexy, the inconvenient. He understands that the biggest opportunities often hide where no one wants to look. That's how empires are built. Not by duplication, but by differentiation. Not by echoing others, but by seeing what others can't. And the only way to see what others can't is to train your mind to think differently. That means taking time every day, not just to consume, but to reflect, to strategize, to ask uncommon questions. Because uncommon questions produce uncommon insights, and uncommon insights applied consistently create uncommon lives. Another key mental shift is this: wealth is not about effort alone, it's about leverage. The person who trades time for money will always be capped. But the person who thinks in terms of systems, assets, and multipliers begins to unlock exponential growth. And all of that begins in the mind. You must begin to ask, how can this result be achieved without my constant effort? How can I build something once that pays me repeatedly? How can I multiply this value without multiplying my hours? These are the questions that shift your operating system from laborer to builder, from worker to owner, from earner to creator. And once your mind adopts that frame, everything changes. You begin to delegate, automate, systemize. You begin to think in terms of cause and effect, not just action and reward. And that shift from linear thinking to leveraged thinking is what separates those who survive from those who thrive. Write this down. The wealthiest people in history thought long-term in a world addicted to short-term gratification. They weren't chasing likes, they were building legacy. They weren't reacting to trends, they were creating foundations. They were willing to endure discomfort now for freedom later. And that ability to think and act in decades instead of days is a mental muscle you must build, because the world will tempt you to think small, fast, and shallow. But wealth requires you to think big, slow, and deep. It requires you to zoom out, to delay reward, to stay in the process long after others have quit. And when you do, when you continue to think with that kind of scale and depth, the world begins to bend toward your vision. Not immediately, but inevitably. And let me tell you something few will say: the world does not reward your struggle, it rewards your contribution. You can work long hours, you can suffer, you can sacrifice. But if you're not creating value, it won't matter. And value is always born in the mind first. So if you want to change your income, your lifestyle, your impact, you must first change the quality of your thoughts, upgrade your questions, upgrade your inputs, upgrade your standards. And from there, begin to act in alignment with that new mental identity. This is not easy, but it is available to anyone. That's the beauty of this rule. It doesn't care where you came from. It doesn't require credentials or approval. It only requires commitment, and that commitment begins with thought. So let me close this part with a challenge. For the next 24 hours, become ruthlessly aware of your thoughts. Notice what you think about when you're alone. Notice where your attention goes when you're idle, and begin to redirect it. Not with pressure, but with precision. Choose thoughts of value, vision, and contribution. Repeat them, write them, speak them, and watch quietly, patiently, powerfully as your world begins to change from the inside out. Because this is the mental rule that built every empire of wealth. What you think about, you become. And if you will think long enough, deep enough, and consistently enough about what you're building, nothing can stop it from becoming real. And this is where we separate the daydreamers from the builders. Because many will nod their heads at this truth, but few will act on it. They will understand it in theory, but fail to reprogram their thinking in practice. The builders, however, the ones meant to create empires, begin immediately. They write their goals down, they repeat them daily, they visualize their outcomes, they take time every morning to decide what they will think about and focus on that day. They don't wait for the world to dictate their mental environment, they create it. And through that consistent practice, the mind becomes a tool, not a random stream of thought, but a targeted engine of creation. And once the mind is focused, behavior follows. And when behavior aligns with vision, momentum begins. And when momentum is sustained, the world shifts. Opportunities begin to appear, circumstances rearrange, people notice. But none of that starts until the thought is made dominant, until the vision is made real in the mind. Here's something you may not have heard before. Wealth doesn't just respond to skill, it responds to identity. And identity is built from thought. The man who believes he is a wealth builder begins to think differently, speak differently, choose differently, not because someone told him to, but because his identity demands it. And over time, those thoughts and actions build a track record, and that track record becomes confidence, and confidence becomes credibility, and credibility becomes income, and income becomes impact. But all of it traces back to one seed, a thought consistently held. That's why when you look at the wealthiest men in history, they weren't just smarter or luckier, they were thinkers, deep, structured, consistent thinkers. They asked better questions, they imagined better futures, and they followed that vision with relentless focus and disciplined execution. If you want to join them, start there. Don't look first at your bank account. Look at your mind. Let's get even more practical. Your mind is programmable. Like a computer, it runs on code. That code is your dominant thoughts, repeated often, And like any system, if you input the same thoughts every day, you will produce the same results. So if your current life is not what you want, it's not because something external needs to change, it's because your mental code needs an upgrade. That upgrade begins with repetition. Repetition creates grooves in the mind, like tracks for a sled in the snow. The deeper the track, the easier it is for thought to travel along it. If you want to change your life, you must dig new tracks. Write your goals, speak them aloud. Visualize your ideal life in vivid detail, and then behave today as if it were already yours. The subconscious doesn't know the difference between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. So it begins to adjust your behavior, your perception, and even your posture to match the image you've installed. But none of this happens unless you take control of your thinking. Not once, daily, hourly, because thought is not a one-time event, it's a continuous stream, and if you're not steering it, it will be steered by others, by advertisers, by media, by fear, by familiarity. The individual who builds wealth becomes ruthless about this. He protects his attention like gold. He controls his inputs like a craftsman controls his tools. He doesn't scroll mindlessly. He doesn't consume content that lowers his standard. He doesn't surround himself with people who speak in limitation. He filters every influence with one question: does this align with the wealth I'm building? And if the answer is no, it's removed. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity, because he understands that 1 hour of diluted focus can undo a week of progress, and when you begin to think this way, the world starts to respond in kind. There is a single mental rule that, once understood and applied, has built every empire of wealth the world has ever known. From the merchant kings of old to the titans of modern industry, from steel to software, this rule has operated like a silent architect, guiding decisions, forging fortunes, and raising men from obscurity to immortality. And yet, most people will live their entire lives without even knowing it exists. They'll chase opportunity without direction, effort without aim. They'll confuse busyness with progress and activity with purpose. But the ones who build, truly build, know otherwise. They've discovered this law. They've studied it, they've lived it, and because of it, they've risen above the noise of the world to create something lasting, something valuable, something free. The rule is simple, but its implications are profound. What you think about, you become. That is the foundation, that is the seed, that is the law. And if you understand it, not just intellectually, but practically, you will never be the same. Everything you see around you is once a thought. The chair you're sitting on, the building you're in, the city you call home, all of it began as a thought in someone's mind. Wealth is no different. It is not first material, it is mental. It begins not with money in hand, but with vision in mind. And the one who learns to think with clarity, consistency, and conviction about the life he wants to build, he becomes a magnet for the means to create it. Thought is the blueprint, behavior is the construction, and results are the building. That's why the greatest wealth builders in history didn't start with resources. They started with direction, with a mental image of what they would create and the unshakable decision to move toward it, one disciplined thought at a time. They understood the cause and effect chain that most never see. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Now let me make this practical. If what you think about you become, then the most important decision you'll ever make is what to allow into your mind. Most people guard their money more than their thoughts, but thoughts are the root and money is only the fruit. If you want different results, you must plant different thoughts. That means taking full responsibility for your mental diet. You must ask, what am I feeding my mind? Is it growth-oriented, future-focused, rich with ideas and vision? Or is it filled with noise, negativity, distraction, and doubt? The one who builds wealth begins by curating thought. He selects what he allows into his attention, like a farmer selects seed. Carelessly chosen seed leads to poor harvest, but intentional seed, planted with repetition and care, produces abundance in due time. This is not poetry, it is law. It is the foundation of every result in your life. And this is where we separate the daydreamers from the builders, because many will nod their heads at this truth, but few will act on it. They will understand it in theory, but fail to reprogram their thinking in practice. The builders, however, the ones meant to create empires, begin immediately. They write their goals down. They repeat them daily. They visualize their outcomes. They take time every morning to decide what they will think about and focus on that day. They don't wait for the world to dictate their mental environment. They create it. And through that consistent practice, the mind becomes a tool, not a random stream of thought, but a targeted engine of creation. And once the mind is focused, behavior follows. And when behavior aligns with vision, momentum begins. And when momentum is sustained, the world shifts. Opportunities begin to appear. Circumstances rearrange. People notice, but none of that starts until the thought is made dominant, until the vision is made real in the mind. Here's something you may not have heard before. Wealth doesn't just respond to skill. It responds to identity, and identity is built from thought. The man who believes he is a wealth builder begins to think differently, speak differently, choose differently, not because someone told him to, but because his identity demands it. And over time, those thoughts and actions build a track record, and that track record becomes confidence, and confidence becomes credibility, and credibility becomes income, and income becomes impact. But all of it traces back to one seed, a thought consistently held. That's why when you look at the wealthiest men in history, they weren't just smarter or luckier, they were thinkers. Deep, structured, consistent thinkers. They asked better questions, they imagined better futures, and they followed that vision with relentless focus and disciplined execution. If you want to join them, start there. Don't look first at your bank account. Look at your mind. Let's get even more practical. Your mind is programmable. Like a computer, it runs on code. That code is your dominant thoughts, repeated often. And like any system, if you input the same thoughts every day, you will produce the same results. So if your current life is not what you want, it's not because something external needs to change. It's because your mental code needs an upgrade. That upgrade begins with repetition. Repetition creates grooves in the mind, like tracks for a sled in the snow. The deeper the track, the easier it is for thought to travel along it. If you want to change your life, you must dig new tracks, write your goals, speak them aloud, visualize your ideal life in vivid detail, and then behave today as if it were already yours. The subconscious doesn't know the difference between a vividly imagined experience and a real one, so it begins to adjust your behavior, your perception, and even your posture to match the image you've installed. But none of this happens unless you take control of your thinking. Not once, daily, hourly, because thought is not a one-time event. It's a continuous stream, and if you're not steering it, it will be steered by others, by advertisers, by media, by fear, by familiarity. The individual who builds wealth becomes ruthless about this. He protects his attention like gold. He controls his inputs like a craftsman controls his tools. He doesn't scroll mindlessly. He doesn't consume content that lowers his standard. He doesn't surround himself with people who speak in limitation. He filters every influence with one question: does this align with the wealth I'm building? And if the answer is no, it's removed. Not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Because he understands that 1 hour of diluted focus can undo a week of progress, and when you begin to think this way, the world starts to respond in kind. Now let me leave you with this. You are already becoming something. Whether you're aware of it or not, your current thoughts are shaping your next 90 days, your next year, your next decade. The question is not whether you're changing. You are. The question is whether you're changing by design or by default. The builders, those who construct empires of wealth, choose design. They select their thoughts with precision, they feed their minds with purpose, and they act as though everything they desire is already within reach. And because of that, it eventually is. Not by accident, not by luck, but by law. You become what you think about. That is the rule, and that is the doorway. Walk through it, and everything begins to change. There is a moment, quiet, unglamorous, often unnoticed, when the builder of wealth makes a final decision that changes everything. It's not the decision to start. It's not the decision to try. It's the decision to never go back. Never go back to small thinking. Never go back to doubt. Never go back to disorganized effort, to distraction disguised as productivity, to the exhausting cycle of half-hearted action and fleeting motivation. This decision is a declaration. It is a quiet war cry. It says, from this day forward, I will no longer flirt with my potential. I will marry it. And when this mental line is drawn, the entire structure of your life begins to change, because your mind now operates in one direction forward. Your choices begin to organize around your vision. Your habits tighten, your time sharpens, your words clarify. And those who used to walk beside you, those who were comfortable with the old version of you, will either rise with you or fall away. And both outcomes are progress. The man who builds wealth makes peace with discomfort. He doesn't seek it, but he respects it. He knows that growth is not a feeling, it's a stretch. And every time he reaches beyond what feels familiar, he tears the old mental muscle just enough to build a stronger one. Most people stop here. They confuse the stretch with a sign to stop, but the builder recognizes it as a sign to continue. He knows that when things feel uncertain, he's on the edge of expansion, that the pit in the stomach is not fear, it's fuel. The individual meant to succeed has trained himself to expect this resistance, and more importantly, to move anyway. While others wait to feel ready, he redefines readiness. Readiness is not the absence of fear, it's the presence of purpose. And purpose, when obeyed consistently, overrides every excuse the mind can create. Now let's speak about isolation. The kind of isolation that often comes before elevation. When you begin to build something the world doesn't yet see, especially when you're doing it in silence, in discipline, in alignment, you will feel alone. But this solitude is not punishment, it is preparation. You are being separated from the noise so you can hear your own voice again. You are being pulled away from the crowd so you can learn to lead. You are being stripped of distractions so that clarity can return. And in that silence, in that deep internal focus, you begin to evolve. Slowly at first, then rapidly, because now there is nothing left to dilute your intention. You are fully present, fully awake, fully aligned. And from that alignment, you move with the kind of power that needs no announcement. The world feels it before it hears it. Let me give you a mental distinction that separates builders from bystanders. They delay recognition. Most people crave validation. They want to be seen as successful before they are. They chase titles, attention, applause. But the wealth builder understands that the process must come before the praise, that the work must become the reward, that results will speak louder and more honestly than any proclamation. So he commits to the invisible seasons, the long days without thanks, the efforts no one notices, because he knows that if he sows long enough, the harvest will arrive, not as a surprise, but as a return. And when it does, the recognition will feel different. It will not be needed. It will be observed with gratitude, but never depended upon, because identity is no longer attached to applause, it is attached to purpose, and that makes the builder unshakable. Here's a truth that most avoid. Wealth demands reinvention. You cannot reach your next level by clinging to your current level's identity. The habits that got you here are not the ones that will get you there. The builder knows this. He anticipates evolution. He reviews his routines. He upgrades his systems. He challenges his assumptions. He says, who do I need to become in order to receive what I've asked for? And then he moves toward that identity, even when it's unfamiliar, even when it feels out of reach, because he knows that reality adjusts to identity, not the other way around. And that means if you want more, you must become more. Not more worthy, you're already worthy, but more aligned, more refined, more focused. This is the inner work, the daily work, the quiet, disciplined sculpting of self that becomes the foundation of every outer success. Let's talk about sacrifice. Because every wealth builder eventually discovers this truth. Nothing great is built without the willingness to let go of comfort, of convenience, of old habits, of shallow pleasures. Sacrifice is not suffering, it is selection. It is choosing what matters most over what tempts most. It is the refusal to live a divided life. And when this mindset takes hold, everything begins to simplify. Decisions become easier, boundaries become clearer, momentum becomes faster. Why? Because energy is no longer leaking into indecision. You know who you are, you know what you're building, and anything that doesn't support it is released without apology. This is not arrogance, this is reverence for the vision, for the process, for the calling. The builder treats his time, his mind, his standards like sacred ground, and that reverence becomes magnetism, because the world respects what you respect. Now I want to bring you to the most powerful place in this process, resolve. Resolve is not excitement. It is not a surge of motivation. It is the quiet, steady, unwavering decision to finish what you started, to show up after the applause has faded, to continue after the novelty wears off. Resolve is the engine behind every extraordinary outcome. It doesn't shout, it doesn't waver, it doesn't need proof, it simply continues. And those who build empires of wealth, of impact, of legacy, do so because they develop this inner gear, the one that clicks in when others stop, the one that says, I'm still going, I'm still building, I'm still aligned. And that gear, once engaged, will carry you further than talent, further than luck, further than motivation ever could. It is the proof of who you've become, and that proof is priceless. So if you're still here, listening, absorbing, considering, then something in you is ready for that level of resolve. Something in you has already decided that it's time to move differently, to think like a builder, to act like a professional, to carry yourself as someone who doesn't just consume ideas, but implements them. Because this rule, this mental law, has already begun to take root. You're thinking differently, you're seeing more clearly, and soon you'll be producing more powerfully. All that remains is your consistency. Hold the line, guard your mind, align your actions, and move forward not with haste, but with purpose, because the future is already adjusting to match your new standard. Keep going. The first place this shows up is in your relationship with work. Most people work reactively. They do what's expected and they do it just well enough to avoid consequence. But the individual building wealth works proactively. He doesn't ask, what must I do to get by? He asks, how can I become irreplaceable? He understands that wealth flows to the person who becomes valuable, and value is created through intention. That means showing up early, going beyond the obvious, studying your craft when others are relaxing, thinking deeply about how to serve, improve, and refine. The difference between a worker and a builder is simple. The worker focuses on tasks. The builder focuses on transformation. He transforms problems into solutions, ideas into income, and effort into equity. And this all begins with a single mental shift. Stop trading time. Start multiplying value. Let's examine that. What does it mean to multiply value? It means to solve more meaningful problems, to create systems, to develop assets, to turn a skill into a product into a platform into a business. The wealth builder isn't thinking about how many hours he can work. He's thinking about how to detach his income from his effort. That doesn't mean working less. It means thinking smarter, structuring more intelligently, investing in what compounds. Every empire of wealth was built not just on hard work, but on mental leverage, the ability to apply thought in a way that scales output beyond personal effort. That's how books sell for decades, how software serves millions, how businesses generate cash while you sleep. It's not magic, it's mindset, and the one who masters this frame doesn't hustle endlessly, he builds strategically. There is a mental rule that, once fully embraced, will elevate not just your income, but your entire sense of identity. And it is this: results are not random, they are reflections. Everything in your external life, your income, your relationships, your opportunities, is a mirror of what you have consistently believed and done. And the individual who is meant to build wealth understands this early. He stops treating life as if it's happening to him and starts realizing it's happening from him. Every result is earned. Every outcome is a return on investment of thought, of time, of belief, of focus, and this changes everything. Because if your results are a reflection, not a coincidence, then the power is back in your hands. You no longer have to wait. You no longer have to hope. You simply need to align your thoughts, your behavior, your discipline with the life you desire. And when alignment happens, outcomes become predictable, not immediate, but inevitable. Here's a truth worth remembering. The marketplace pays for clarity. If you're vague about what you do, what you offer, or who you serve, your income will reflect that. But if you're clear, if your thoughts are organized, your message is simple, and your offer is undeniable, you become magnetic. The person building wealth becomes obsessed with clarity. They clarify their mission, their target audience, their unique value. They refine, simplify, and sharpen until everything aligns. And when that clarity meets consistency, trust is built. And trust in the marketplace is gold. It reduces resistance, increases conversions, accelerates growth. But clarity must begin in the mind. You cannot sell clearly until you think clearly. You cannot scale until you simplify, and this is where most stay stuck, in complexity. But the wealth builder is different. He understands that complexity repels wealth and clarity attracts it. Let's talk now about one of the most important forms of wealth, time. The individual who understands this mental rule begins to treat time as sacred. He doesn't waste it, he doesn't kill it, he doesn't trade it cheaply. He invests it, he multiplies it, he protects it with boundaries, routines, and systems. Because he understands that time once spent cannot be regained. And every hour invested in low-value thinking is an hour stolen from high-value building. That's why the wealth builder creates a schedule that serves his vision. He doesn't drift, he doesn't see how the day goes. He plans, he executes, he reviews. And because of that, his results compound. Not because he worked longer, but because he worked with precision, and that precision is a product of thought. Let me be very clear. You cannot build long-term wealth with short-term thinking. You must begin to think in decades. You must be willing to plant today what may not sprout until years later. That's how forests are grown. That's how legacies are built. Most people want the result without the season, but the wealth builder understands there is a season for planting, a season for watering, and a season for harvesting, and each requires patience, persistence, and belief. That belief is mental currency. Every time you stick to the plan when it's hard, you're investing belief. Every time you wake up early to sharpen your edge, you're investing belief. Every time you show up for your goal, even when no one claps, you're building the root system that will support the harvest when it finally arrives. And it will arrive, not because you hoped, but because you prepared. I want you to leave this part with one decision: to treat your thoughts like investments. You wouldn't put your money into a business with no clarity, no return, and no purpose. So why put your attention there? From now on, every thought must pass a test. Does it align with your goal? Does it serve your future? Does it multiply your momentum? If not, it's an expense, and it's time to cut it. Because this is how wealth is built, not in a single moment of inspiration, but in thousands of small daily decisions to think like a builder, to live like a builder, to become the kind of person who attracts, creates, and multiplies value everywhere they go. Now let me ask you a question, one that every wealth builder must answer. What are you optimizing for? Is it ease, approval, distraction, or is it leverage, ownership, freedom, and impact? Your thoughts will always bend toward what you value most. So if you haven't defined your values, your mind will drift to the loudest voice in the room. That's how people end up chasing things they don't really want, because they never stop to decide what truly matters. But the builder, the one committed to wealth, lives by principle. He knows what he stands for. He knows what he's moving toward. And because of that, his life begins to self-organize around the vision. Distractions fall away, weakness fades, and what remains is focus. Pure, directed, unshakable focus. There comes a point in the journey of wealth where the external no longer excites you the way it once did. The numbers grow, the status increases, the lifestyle expands, but none of it can substitute the quiet pride of self-mastery. Because the individual meant to build lasting wealth eventually realizes this truth: the greatest reward isn't what you gain, it's who you become. You begin the journey for freedom, for income, for independence. But somewhere along the way you discover that the true wealth is internal. It's discipline, it's clarity, it's the ability to command yourself. That's the real currency. That's the empire no recession can touch. And once you've tasted this kind of internal wealth, your relationship with life begins to change. You stop chasing. You start attracting. You stop proving. You start becoming. You move with calm certainty, because you know the man who governs himself becomes ungovernable by circumstance. This shift doesn't happen by accident. It is trained. It is built rep by rep like a muscle. You train it every time you wake up on time, even when it's hard. You train it every time you choose focus over distraction. You train it when you say no to what's easy and yes to what's aligned. And just like physical strength, this internal power begins to compound. You no longer need external pressure to keep you moving. The standard lives within you. You don't need others to believe in you. You already do. And from that inner resolve, you begin to generate something rare: momentum. But not just momentum of action, momentum of character. You begin to become someone who does what they said they'd do. Someone whose words match their walk. Someone who no longer negotiates with their vision. And the world recognizes this energy. It cannot be faked, it cannot be bought, it can only be earned. Let's talk about momentum. True momentum, the kind that builds empires. It doesn't come from occasional surges of effort. It comes from rhythm, from daily non-negotiables, from showing up even when it's inconvenient. Most people confuse momentum with speed, but speed burns out, rhythm sustains. The wealth builder creates rhythm in his life. Morning routines, thinking time, training blocks, strategic execution, reflection. He designs his days the way an architect designs a city. Everything has a place. Everything serves a purpose, and because of this rhythm, results begin to stack. Energy is conserved, decisions are streamlined, focus is multiplied, and suddenly what used to feel overwhelming becomes automatic. That's the power of rhythm. It turns effort into identity, and once your identity aligns with success, results are no longer something you chase. They become something you embody. Now let's address an invisible ceiling that keeps most people stuck: the fear of outgrowing others. The moment you begin to rise, you'll feel tension. Tension between who you were and who you're becoming, between old environments and new standards, between relationships rooted in comfort and a vision rooted in growth. And if you're not careful, you'll begin to shrink, not because you lack potential, but because you fear leaving others behind. But hear this clearly: your growth is not a betrayal, it is a responsibility. You were not called to stay the same for the sake of belonging. You were called to rise for the sake of becoming. And when you choose your future over your familiarity, you give others permission to do the same. Not everyone will follow. Not everyone will understand. But you weren't meant to fit. You were meant to lead. and leadership always begins with separation. Write this down. Growth is uncomfortable, but stagnation is suffocating. And the longer you delay the next version of yourself, the heavier your life will feel. The things you tolerate become your limitations. The boundaries you avoid become your burdens. The people you pacify become the ones who hold you back. The wealth builder makes peace with discomfort, not because he enjoys it, but because he fears regret more than resistance. He knows that everything he wants lives on the other side of unfamiliar decisions. And he doesn't wait until he feels ready, he moves when it's time, even if it's messy, even if it's misunderstood, because he trusts that clarity expands in motion, and motion begins when alignment overpowers anxiety, when purpose speaks louder than fear. Another vital truth: you must outgrow your old problems. The same challenges, the same cycles, the same excuses, they are not a sign that you're failing. They're a sign that you've stopped evolving. The builder measures success not just by what he gains, but by what he no longer tolerates. He upgrades his problems. He no longer worries about bills. He's focused on buying assets. He's no longer trapped by distraction. He's learning how to scale. He's no longer trying to survive. He's studying how to multiply. That's how you measure growth, not by trophies, but by the level of questions you now ask, by the quality of your decisions, by the depth of your focus. Every stage of wealth requires a higher version of you, not a louder version, a deeper, more aligned, more disciplined version. And the faster you let go of the previous level, the faster the next one reveals itself. Now I want to remind you of something you may have forgotten. You're allowed to evolve without permission. You don't need applause to sharpen your edge. You don't need approval to raise your standard. You don't need validation to become more disciplined, more focused, more powerful. The man who waits for consensus never builds an empire. But the one who trusts his inner alignment, even in silence, becomes impossible to ignore. This is how quiet power is born. Not from noise, but from inner congruence. From knowing who you are, what you're building, and why it matters. That kind of clarity doesn't need a stage. It builds its own, and eventually the world will notice. But by then you won't be looking for recognition. You'll be too focused on refinement, because the builder isn't chasing attention. He's building something that lasts longer than applause. Let me leave you with this. The most powerful wealth you will ever build is the ability to trust yourself. To look in the mirror and say, if no one shows up, I will. If no one believes, I still will. If no one understands, I still know what I'm here to do. That kind of trust comes from alignment, from honoring your word when no one is watching, from repeating your standards until they become your state, from moving forward even when the path is unclear because the mission is not. This is how wealth is built, not just financially, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. And when that foundation is in place, nothing external can shake what you've internalized. Not failure, not delay, not criticism, because the one who trusts himself walks with a kind of peace that cannot be borrowed, bought, or broken. There's a final shift, one that only the serious few ever reach, and it is the moment you stop measuring your progress by what you have and start measuring it by what you've mastered. Because in the end, wealth is not about accumulation, it's about calibration. Calibration of thought, of energy, of standards. And when you begin to master yourself, your mind, your moods, your movements, you realize something most people never do. Wealth is not the finish line, it's the byproduct. The real reward is command, the ability to direct your focus, discipline your attention, and stay rooted in purpose while the world spins around you. This is what allows the wealth builder to sustain, to scale, to lead. He's not moved by noise, not seduced by trends. He is centered. And that center, once developed, becomes his empire. Everything else simply mirrors it. Let's break this down further. When you've trained your mind to think in terms of systems and principles, you stop chasing outcomes and begin engineering them. The same way a pilot doesn't hope the plane lands, he runs the checklist. The same way a farmer doesn't wish for harvest, he follows the season. Builders of wealth don't wait for motivation, they follow their principles. They think in rules. And the final rule, the one that locks everything into place, is simple. How I do one thing is how I do everything. Once this is installed, the edges of your life sharpen. Sloppiness becomes unacceptable. Laziness becomes foreign. Every action is either aligned or discarded. You clean your space. You monitor your language. You prepare your body. You control your environment. Not out of vanity, but because you understand that the external must now reflect the internal standard you've committed to. This final level is where refinement begins. You're no longer just executing, you're perfecting. You're no longer just building, you're optimizing. You begin to move like someone who's already achieved the result. Not in arrogance, but in embodiment. Your posture changes, your rhythm smooths, Your presence expands. People can feel it. Clients, colleagues, strangers, they don't know what changed, but they respond differently. Why? Because your energy no longer leaks. Your thoughts no longer contradict your actions, and your life no longer battles itself. You are whole, you are congruent, and in a world filled with fractured identities, that congruence becomes a lighthouse. It attracts opportunity, it repels distraction, and most importantly, it builds the kind of peace no check can purchase. Now let me speak directly to the test that shows up here. Success becomes your new temptation. It tempts you to slow down, to relax, to compromise, to say, I've earned this, I've done enough. And this is where most people stop. They confuse growth with exhaustion. But the builder understands rest is not the same as retreat. You rest to refuel, not to regress. You pause to sharpen, not to shrink. Because the mission didn't end with the first win. The mission evolved. And now that you have more power, more clarity, more reach, you have a higher responsibility. Not to prove yourself, but to express yourself fully, authentically, without apology. And this is where true fulfillment lives. Not in what you take, but in what you build. Not in what you gain, but in who you serve. And to serve well, you must stay sharp. So what keeps you sharp? Simplicity. You don't complicate success, you refine it. You strip away what's unnecessary. You build elegant systems. You master one thing instead of chasing 10. You understand that excellence is not about adding more, it's about doing less with more precision. That's what makes the greats untouchable. They are not overwhelmed, they are dialed in, focused, intentional, and their life reflects it, not by accident but by design, and design is the secret most ignore. They think wealth is made by hustle, but hustle without design is chaos. Design is what makes success sustainable. Design is what makes effort efficient. Design is what allows your life to scale without your peace crumbling. And so the wealth builder becomes obsessed with it. He designs his time, his energy, his communication, his rest. Nothing is left to chance, because he knows life reflects structure, and wealth, real wealth, is a structure of the mind. You've heard this before, but now you understand it. Success leaves clues, but it also leaves systems. And the final mental rule is this. If you want to stay successful, install systems that support the identity you've chosen. Systems of thought, systems of behavior, systems of review. This is not boring. This is freedom. Because the more structured your life becomes, the less willpower you need to operate at a high level. Success stops being effortful. It becomes automated. Like brushing your teeth, like breathing. You just are that person now. And the systems ensure you stay that person, even when life gets hard, even when emotions get loud. This is why the wealth builder doesn't collapse when the market shifts. He doesn't panic when the environment changes. His identity is reinforced daily by the systems he's built. And so he stays the course while others sway in confusion. And here's the final unlock. When your identity is aligned and your systems are installed, your vision begins to accelerate. Not because the world got easier, but because you removed the internal friction. You're no longer battling self-doubt, inconsistency, distraction. You've narrowed your focus, you've cleaned the signal, and now everything you do compounds faster. Your brand grows, your network deepens, your body strengthens, your message sharpens, your income multiplies, and you begin to experience the rarest form of wealth, time freedom paired with internal mastery. You wake up with purpose, you move with peace, you no longer fear loss because you know how to build. You no longer crave validation because you live in integrity. You no longer chase escape because you've built a life you don't need to run from. That is real wealth. That is the final destination of this rule. So what now? You protect the standard, you expand the mission, you teach what you've learned, and you remind yourself daily of the rule that brought you here. What you think about, you become. You started by thinking like a builder. Then you became one. Then you thought like a leader. Now you are one. And from here forward, your only task is to continue thinking in alignment with the version of yourself that builds, leads, and leaves a legacy. If you do that, you'll never have to chase wealth again. You will become it.